This program is brought to you in association with First National Bank of Botswana.
Fnbb, how can we help you?
The 2022-2023 National Budget speech was possibly one of the most monumental budget announcements in Botswana, as Minister of Finance and Economic Development, Honorable Peggy Serame, was the first woman to have done so in the history of this country. While the sentimentalism behind this moment has been widely shared amongst Botswana, the satisfaction with what she shared from her briefcase is just as widely varying. This is no surprise because this was a budget announcement that followed an especially challenging year in 2021, where the pandemic almost flatlined what was left of the economy. So naturally, expectations were very high. It then comes as no shock that the Ministry of Health and Wellness got the largest share of the cake, having to replenish pharmaceutical supplies that are almost depleted, while also fighting the ongoing pandemic. The Ministry of Basic Education followed in second, with the Ministry of Defence, Justice and Security coming in third. In an economy that is in desperate need of being diversified from mining, an eyebrow or two were raised in realizing that the ministries responsible for the agricultural and manufacturing sectors did not make it to the top three largest allocations as being considered viable options to grow the economy away from mineral revenue. It is then on this backdrop that First Issues was at Fnbb Botswana's 28th edition budget review seminar under the theme The Great Reset, Investing for Sustainable Change, to get clarifying insights and thoughts from key experts into the budget announcement. Quantitative analyst at the First National Bank of Botswana, Kgomalemo Basile, joins us now. Kgomalemo, thank you so much for coming on First Issues and affording us your time. As ever, it's a pleasure having you on our platform. Today we are reviewing the national budget as announced by Honorable Minister Serame. So, you know, our economy is highly dependent on mineral revenue, or mining, if you will. And for the longest time, government has been talking about diversifying from the sector to such industries as agriculture and tourism. But surprisingly, in this current budget, these ministries' sectors, or these sectors' ministries, did not make the top three of the largest allocations at the national budget. So what consequences do you think this will have in successfully seeing the diversification of our economy, if any at all?
You're absolutely right. Mining is a significant contributor to Botswana's growth profile, and we've seen that effect through the pandemic and the subsequent recovery over last year. But I think over the last couple of years especially, we've seen some form of diversification away from mining and into tertiary sectors. But you rightly highlight that there's still more diversification needed within other primary sectors such as agriculture, as well as manufacturing, especially to address the unemployment issues that we go through. And we are seeing a strong intention by government to ramp up or speed up the delivery of certain infrastructure projects across the country, including development of road networks, as well as rail networks, and electricity as well as water security across the country. We've seen these developments progressing over the course of last year, despite the challenges that we were facing, and we expect them to continue over the course of this year. And this is especially critical in the sense that across some sectors, you do require properly functioning infrastructure to be able to support growth. Also, over and above that, we are seeing revisions to certain programs that are aimed at trying to promote agricultural production. We're seeing the doing away of ESPAD, which has been replaced by a new program to try and ensure that food security is actually attained within Botswana. And over and above that, additional infrastructure development in terms of silo development is happening within the Pandamatinga region, which is aimed at ensuring that Botswana's grain capacity actually improves to what we've seen previously.
One of the highlights of the national budget were the inefficiencies that were mentioned, one of them being the very high wage bill. And to deal with these inefficiencies, government is looking to reduce costs, and one of the measures that government is willing to take is reviewing or scrapping altogether the scarce skill allowances and maybe the overtime pay rates, right? But looking at the already unsatisfactory civil service performance as acknowledged by Honourable Minister Serame, how do you see this playing out regarding the civil service delivery?
It's a tricky one that they need to manage quite carefully. So first of all, yes, the public wage bill is a concern. I think it has been for several years. And what the government has done in the past is that they've done away with some vacancies that existed for a certain number of years that were never filled. And I think given the pandemic, what they're considering now is restructuring and trying to introduce more flexible working programs for the labor force in order to try and improve productivity within that sector as well. And also managing the kind of recruitment processes that they undertake, especially given the key priorities that are listed right now.
Government said that it is in the process of reconfiguring some of its state-owned entities in efforts to reduce redundancies, as some of these entities have more or less the same mandate. But the downside that was cited by individuals and some unions is that this move has the potential to exacerbate the ever-growing unemployment rate. Whether that is the case, or that would be the case, what convincing argument do you think could be made that would highlight some of the positives that could come from this?
State-owned enterprises, discussion that's been happening for years, and several state-owned enterprises have been highlighted actually for privatization. And the key one being BMC, I think Air Botswana is also one of them. The case in terms of BMC, I think, is very strong. So local farmers are not getting fair market value for their cattle. And instead of addressing the issues that exist within the structure, we're now overriding it and letting go of our cattle live across borders. And within doing that, we're going back in terms of the level of processing that we're able to engage in. So we're not packaging this beef to export anymore. We're not able to even benefit from potentially even creating glue from hooves and all this other stuff.
Khomalema, where to now? Speaking to today's theme of the Great Reset, investing for sustainable change, do you think that the 2022-23 national budget did enough to adequately address and give adequate insights into exactly what needs to be done to resuscitate the economy and, sustainably so?
The key thing that popped out for me was definitely an admission of certain problems that existed. That's the first step. And priorities being aligned to trying to address those problems. Now, I think in terms of the way the budget is structured, these aren't issues that can be addressed over one fiscal year. These are longer-term, medium-term objectives. So it's a bit reassuring that government actually admitted issues that exist. They highlighted measures to try and address these issues. I think what now we expect is how strongly their intention to try and address these issues over the medium term will be. We do expect to see some more traction around some of these solutions that they've proposed.
The budget review seminar continued into the evening, where critical dialogue on significant challenges, weaknesses and strengths of the economy were discussed.
As a bank, we have in the past 28 years hosted this event, as we believe that the national budget affects us all, and we want to ensure that it's accessible to all Botswana. We are also passionate about sharing insights with all our stakeholders and bringing in various thought leaders who are always ready and willing to share their knowledge and expertise with us.
To achieve some of the mandates highlighted in the national budget, such as transforming Botswana to being an export-led economy, government needs to strategically position herself within the African continent to lure in investors who will be a key resource in this transformation. Just exactly how can this be achieved? We're now with economist at the Rand Merchant Bank, Daniel Kavishe. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on First Issues and affording us your time today. We're talking the Fnbb budget review. And during your presentation, you asserted that Botswana was among the top 10 most attractive countries to invest in Africa. But given the not so great ease of doing business rating that the country has based on weak implementation policies that further exacerbate red tape. What would you say are some not so obvious reforms that could be executed to leverage on this investment attractiveness rating?
There are a lot of struggles across the region, really, with respect to countries being able to improve their own rankings from a perspective of making it easier for investors or even domestic businesses and corporates and institutions to operate. Rightly so, there is a lot of red tape, there are a lot of legalities that sometimes can delay processes, or what we rather consider the optimal form of execution across projects. And I think that really is it. In order for Botswana to improve on these rankings, it does need to accelerate the pace at which it executes a lot of the projects that are not stated just on a fiscal basis, but I think also create that conducive environment for private investors to be able to either invest or reinvest across the market. I think it's absolutely possible. It's one of those economies that we think are going to be growing at a palatable pace, just over 4% over the next few years. We do think that there are a lot of opportunities for Botswana, ranging from the renewable energies, which really supports secondary industries. Lots of opportunities still, in my view, in the primary sectors, even in agriculture. And I think just creating that conducive environment will be the first one. And then having the, rapport to execute very quickly would be another thing that those in charge need to accelerate in order to improve Botswana's rankings even more.
One could say that Botswana's undiversified economy is a disaster waiting to happen. I mean, prime example is what we saw happen at the outset of the pandemic with diamond sales. You spoke of agriculture being one such sector that the government could focus on to move economic growth away from minerals. So how can that happen? Paying special attention to your example of how Ghana was able to do the same?
There are a couple of things to consider. Of course, completely two separate markets, completely two different climatic conditions to work with. Ghana versus Botswana, potentially not very fair comparison if you're only going to look at it from an agri perspective. They have prolonged seasons of rain, and that does support a lot of their exports, specifically coming from the cocoa side. What we are finding is that even in this semi-arid environment such as Botswana, there's still opportunities to be able to really capitalize on some of the other high-end products, at least from crop farming in the agricultural space. And I think we're starting to see that a lot with citrus farming. That is something that's going to tick off really and take off in the Botswana market, and it's definitely something worth considering. There could be explorations that could be done in other crop products that could be done for a market like this, combining with high-end technology to maximize in yield and produce, and of course capitalizing on the fact that we have an expansive agribusiness network now across the continent. So in my view, I do think that increasing investment into this sector deals not only with contribution to GDP, but then it also starts dealing with some of your other challenges, which is reducing unemployment within the market, making sure that especially the youth do find opportunities in this sector to capitalize on it. So that's really one thing to consider. What I was trying to really hone in on when it comes to diversification, it's the diversification of your export earnings. And that extends a little bit more to just considering what could take place in agriculture. There is a moment in time where we have to take a very strong look and say, over 80% of our export earnings are coming in from diamond sector. Is it possible to consider additional minerals? Could Botswana potentially export energy? Is that something that's worth considering? Could Botswana become a hub for the ICT sector? Could this really be a logistical center as well and earn foreign reserves or direct investments from other sectors versus diamonds? I think that's really where the level of conversation needs to be for the country.
Still on the issue of diversifying the economy, let us talk about manufacturing as one such sector that could help with that. It is my humble understanding that most of what we could manufacture here would need for us to import raw materials. So would you not then say that would render this an unviable option to exploit, looking at the costs and logistics primarily associated with sourcing these raw materials?
We need to start by what are you going to manufacture? I think that's probably the easiest thing. What I would really consider is you work with what you already have. Botswana has one of the most flourishing livestock farming industries globally, exporting some of the best meat internationally. Some would contend it does have the best meat globally. What really you can create from having such a sizable livestock market is the ability to move into an industry like tannery industry and work off leather products, right? So in this instances, all inputs would be sourced primarily in Botswana. You wouldn't necessarily have to get them from other parts of the world. And so when we speak about manufacturing, everyone sort of thinks about these large factories that they see in the expanses of Asia. But working in a market like Botswana, you would really source the bulk of your materials and you will work with a product that you already naturally do well here. Another thing that people don't also speak about is the beneficiation process actually also sits, and we consider that as part of your manufacturing as well. So that in itself, from your minerals, could be an area worth exploring.
Considering that rising inflation might actually be one of the challenges to growth of a lot of sectors, especially SMEs, who are the life force of most economies, especially here in Africa, what could be some of the best practices that could be adopted to help cushion against possible negative impact?
It's a tough one. You know, regionally, we're in an environment where inflation has ticked up. The bulk of the increase has been external factors. We've seen consistently since the pandemic oil prices tick up. And that has translated into the inflation profile for various countries, right? And so countries are having to contend with a much higher inflationary environment than they had a few years ago. You spoke about input costs being quite high, and the fact that Botswana is a small and open economy, having to import a lot of its input costs for other industries, has also contributed towards that. The other reasons, however, were changes that were made locally, increases in VAT, and that, of course, has had an impact on your final inflation profile. What does this really mean? Inflation is really an indicator for us that there will be additional pressures facing your consumers, and I think government has to be very cognizant of that. One of the things we've seen in other countries is that sometimes, you have additional subsidies being placed to support the transport sector in a period where oil prices tick up. I don't necessarily think that would be a strategy that's being taken here, given just the broader funds that are there already available to support the transport industry. But what I do think is that effectively over time, you will see a higher interest rate environment to curb inflationary pressures. So that's coming. We can say with some degree of certainty that the tick up in inflation that has happened now will start tapering off in a year's time, and after that, as interest rate comes in. This unfortunate side effect of higher interest rates is to your point, that businesses then would be impacted by higher debt servicing costs. And this is the fine balance then that the central bank will have to make between hiking interest rates at a level that really can curtail further increases in inflation, but at the same time remains accommodative for businesses in the country.
It would be remiss to not talk about the tourism sector in relation to the future of Botswana's economy, obviously due to the fact this industry was one of the most hard hit since the outbreak of the coronavirus. Director at Chobe Holdings, John Gibson, talks about the future of the sector, primarily focusing on the high-value, low-volume model adopted in the Chobe area, which has been referred to as Botswana's tourism hub.
Certainly it's a model that has led to significant growth and served Botswana incredibly well with the tourism sector that is the envy of the region. And we need to consider that the geography of the Okavango Delta in the Northwest District really sort of essentially supports that model. But I think what we'll see is that in time what will develop is a more nuanced model, where some areas in Botswana will support high value, low impact tourism, but other areas might see more medium impact tourism. And I think the important thing is that we mustn't ever lose sight of what makes Botswana truly special, which is significant wild spaces, which present the space for animals to exist and people to experience it in an environment that is conducive to getting away from the world. And I think so often we see tourism around the world that degrades the natural environment. And there are, for example, in New Zealand, the Instagram shot of somebody standing alone on a mountain peak. Yeah. There is a queue of people behind them. And the actual non-Instagram experience has been significantly devalued. So I think that the model has worked very, very well for Botswana. It's served Botswana very well over the last 3 decades. It's a model that will evolve because we are in a rapidly developing country. But we need to make sure that we don't get rid of what is so important to the Botswana tourism product in an effort to broaden tourism. So tourism is an important driver of employment within northern Botswana, of economic development, and we need to really protect that and we need to make sure that we don't have a negative impact on the environment.
So maybe my question was geared towards, how the price points for these resorts is somewhat disregards local tourists who may not have the monetary resources to, experience the Delta. What I want to find out is, are we going to see a revision of this model and maybe consider packages which are more inclusive, especially of local tourists?
Every customer is of high value in the tourism industry, and we mustn't ever forget that. But I think we need to really look at sort of the environment in which we operate. And I think we will see moving forward, there will be far more opportunity for people from the whole sub-region to visit these spaces. But simply increasing the number of people doesn't sort of essentially solve what you've presented as a problem. I think it's vitally important that everyone in Botswana has the ability to essentially participate and see the magnificent wildlife that is available in this country. And there are different ways of doing that. And certainly I think that what will happen is that the tourism policies will evolve. And though in that evolution, it will become easier. But I think there are other reasons that people don't access these tourism areas. So for example, the road access is poor often. Air access is very difficult. And particularly in the deep delta, air access is very difficult and expensive. And that has an impact on how people enjoy the delta. So I think it's important that we improve access into these areas. It's important that we develop policies that protect these areas while supporting potentially higher volume. So there's no point just saying, well, we're just going to have higher volume. We must have policies that then are able to protect the environment and maybe control access in a way that allows increased utilization. And what we would like to see is, for example, far more differential pricing across Botswana.
This program was brought to you in association with First National Bank of Botswana.
FNB, how can we help you?